Greetings everyone, Brett here with Hammerhead Model Making, back with another full build video. In today's video we're going to be working on the ModelSVIT P-51H Mustang in 1/48 scale. And this is an interesting kit. I had not really heard about this company, or at least had seen a lot from this company prior to discovering this kit. And I was very intrigued as a fan of the Mustang and wanting to kind of build through all the iterations of the Mustang. This was definitely a logical one to add to my collection, and kind of decided to build this one on a whim. And I'm really glad that I did. I would like to add a little caveat to this video here, and that is that I started this one after I remodeled my hobby room and added more room to my workbench, and I'm actually filming this one in with a setup that I'm not used to yet. So there's going to be a couple times where like my hand is blocking the airbrushing or whatever, and it's just because I'm still learning how to film in this new portion of my workbench. Normally I have the camera over my left shoulder when I'm filming, and that's how I've been doing it for almost 4 years now. This video is being filmed with the camera over my right shoulder, so I apologize if things don't quite seem as polished as I normally try to make them, but just wanted to let you know that's what's going on. To this kit, I will also be adding a set of 3D decals from Kellic. And so right now what I'm doing is just removing some of the molded on detail from the kit parts so that they can later accept the 3D decals. And in all fairness to the manufacturer, the kit details are quite nice. They do have a lot of good like surface detail. A lot of the interior details really well represented and molded. You can see there's like wires and things like that on the interior of this sidewall. So if you chose to build this one without the 3D decals, I think it would still produce a really nice looking cockpit interior. I wanted to take things up to the next level with the 3D decals and really kind of show off, just for you guys, your benefit, like how nice they can be. And I think personally that the 3D decals are a huge improvement over like pre-painted photo etch. And I would definitely like to incorporate the 3D decals more into my builds in the future. But as we start with the cockpit here, the kit comes supplied with a decent photo etch fret here. And you can see there's multiple parts in here. Most of them I'm going to end up not using, but it is nice they include a decent amount of photo etch in there. The actual instrument panel face is photo etch itself, and it looks all right. Not my favorite, but it doesn't look horrible. So putting the seat together, we do use some photo etch pieces for like the side supports, and these are just going to get glued on with some super glue. And I think one of the things about this kit that people might, if they're not familiar with the manufacturer, this is basically like the highest end version of like a limited run kit. That's the impression that it gets. I could be totally wrong in like the specifics of that, but that's just kind of the impression that it gives to me. And so are often times when you're putting parts together or trying to dry fit parts that there aren't like really good solid locating tabs or pins, or this part at 100% definitely goes in right here. So you definitely need to make sure that you are dry fitting everything and test fitting everything before you ever commit to glue, because you could get yourself into trouble thinking you know how it goes together, but then if you've got glue on it and you're trying to figure out how to put something together, you're probably just going to end up causing problems for yourself. So just be aware that this kit is not one that I would necessarily recommend to like a first-time modeler or a beginner. It is going to require multiple different modeling skills to get this one done, but at the same time it's definitely not one that like is impossible or just like a huge drag to build. My overall impression of the build was very enjoyable, and I had a lot of fun working on this kit. But I just want to point out that it's not like new person friendly, new builder friendly. I definitely put a couple of builds under your belt first before trying one of these. There are a lot of little parts that go into the cockpit, lots of great little details. You know, the oxygen regulator, this little flare gun that attaches to the floor of the cockpit, the little crank handle that the pilot would use to open up the canopy. The the rudder pedals are actually super well detailed, and you can actually see the tiny little North American logo on the rudder pedals, which is awesome. But the way that they attach to the floor is just like this single post, and then they're just kind of supposed to like cantilever over the center of the cockpit floor. And so you really need to be careful gluing those in, and especially like as you start painting and manipulating the part, that you don't end up breaking those off, because the connection point is quite small. So just be aware that, you know, some of these parts might be a little bit more difficult than others to attach. So at this point, all the cockpit stuff is pretty much assembled, and we're going to go ahead and get it ready for paint, although we are going to do some other things before we move to the paint, but it doesn't hurt to get these parts ready. So one of my favorite things to do when having to prime and paint multiple little parts like this is to use little craft sticks, a little bit of poster putty, and get those all ready. So now we're going to move on to the wheel well and get this prepared. This is a multi-part endeavor. If you've seen my video of the Edward Mustangs that I built a couple months ago, this is going to feel very similar, and it's a fairly similar setup as well, where you build the sidewalls and then you kind of add the internal bracing, and then you have a part that goes on top to cover it all up. And you do, again, like I mentioned before, you really need to make sure that your dry fitting parts, just to make sure that you understand how they're going to get installed and aligned. You can see there's like faint little like divots in the plastic where the parts are supposed to go. And this was an interesting part. So this part, you are supposed to bend kind of into an S shape. And I ended up just finding it easier to separate the parts like on the bend line and then install them. I was able to get things to fit better that way, as opposed to like actually bending the plastic and then trying to get it to fit, because it didn't quite make the shape. It didn't fit the shape correctly. So just as a heads up, I found it easier to separate the parts and then glue them together on the wheel, you know, like in the wing itself, like I'm doing here. Finally, we get the front portion all boxed in, and these parts are, I mean, overall, other than the part that you had to bend, they actually fit really nicely once you figure out how they all go together. So that's, you know, definitely helpful. Moving on to the rest of the fuselage here, we're going to build this is the part where the radiator, you know, exhausts out the bottom of the aircraft, and it's, for what it is, it's decent. I think for me, one of my complaints about the kit is that it actually didn't have the oil cooler detail that you would see down the oil cooler and radiator intake on the bottom. The P-51H has a longer intake duct, so I mean, unless you're shining a light directly down in there, you probably wouldn't really see it anyways, but just one of those things that I like to know is there. The tail wheel well area is quite complex with some very, very thin, delicate parts that go into there, but it all fit flawlessly. You know, very nice. At this time, I'm also adding the exhaust stubs. What's interesting about the P-51H is that the exhaust stubs are essentially fully enclosed in the fuselage, so they don't actually protrude out. There's a shroud over them, and it was just easier to get those installed now and then not have to worry about it. Another interesting thing about the P-51H, if you're not familiar with it, is like your initial reaction when you look at it, you're like, oh, it's a P-51D, because it bears a very striking resemblance to the P-51D. But as you really start to study it, you realize that it actually is quite different than the P-51D. And in fact, the P-51H is essentially a brand new airframe built from the ground up. It uses a lot of inspiration and a lot of design cues from the P-51D, but it is its own aircraft. And as the more you look at it, the more you'll start to see like, oh yeah, that's a different shape. That's different, you know, length or whatever. So it's kind of fun to see the overall differences between this version of like pretty much the penultimate version of the P-51 versus like the popular P-51D. So moving on to painting, we primed everything, or I primed everything with Mr. Surfacer 1500 black, and now I'm going to do basically like a highlight coat here with some white. This is going to just help add a little bit of contrast, especially to some of the darker areas of the aircraft that'll be harder to see. It just helps create a little bit more brightness and contrast when we start laying down the actual paint colors. And I'm not trying to be like super precise here. Really, this is just going to help us give some value to our colors. There will be multiple colors used throughout the interior of the Mustang here. So the first one we're going to be using is this light green chromate color. This is the same color that I used, pretty much the whole same process that I used on the Edward Mustangs that I built a little while ago. So this won't look terribly unfamiliar. And I'm really starting to like this color. Before, my interior green color of choice was the Ammo MiG interior green, but this one's edging it out just a little bit. Next up, for the wheel wells, we're going to be using the Tamiya yellow green. So this is going to be more of like your classic zinc chromate type color. And this goes on the wheel wells, well, the main landing gear wheel wells and the tail wheel area. I really like this color. I did have a version from Ammo MiG that was also nice, but I've been having a hard time trying to find it. So the Tamiya version, it does a good job. It's like a, very close second. So we get these all painted, get these areas done, and you can see I am painting this slightly translucent or less opaque than normal, just to allow some of that white to shine through and create a little bit of contrast. For the armored seat and the instrument panel, I am using this camouflage green color. Oftentimes the seat in Mustangs, and this isn't like true for every single Mustang, but many of them, for whatever reason, and in fact I've seen this in other aircraft as well, but the seat was a different shade of green from the rest of the cockpit. So I don't know if that's because the seats were manufactured somewhere else and were painted differently, but it's just an interesting detail and helps add a little bit more visual interest to the cockpit. So with all the primary colors airbrushed on, we can go ahead and start doing our detailing painting. So this is just being done with Vallejo acrylics. Specifically their model range of colors, which are formulated for brush painting. These aren't like airbrush paints. And the footage is sped up right now. I have it sped up like 3 or 4 times, so it looks like I'm going pretty fast. But oftentimes these paint sessions where I'm brush painting all these details, they can take some time, but the patience is part of like getting a good result here. There's this, and I still have yet to figure out what this part is. I think it's some kind of like beacon light, but it sits on the back shelf behind the pilot, behind the pilot's seat. I'm not quite sure exactly if that's true, but that's kind of the best reasoning that I can come up with. Similar to the P-51Ds, the armor plate that goes behind the pilot seat, the top portion of it is painted black. And this is one of those things that like I could easily mask it and spray it, but it's like I already had the paint out, and it's not a big deal just to brush paint that and just knock that out and get that done. Now I'm going to be painting the canvas boot over the mechanics of the control column with a buff color. I've seen like the gamut of colors for the canvas materials in U.S. fighters during the Second World War, anywhere between like a really dark khaki to an almost brown color to like a light beige color. If you have reference and sources pointing to one color over the other, great. If not, I like a buff color to do that. It just works for me. So now we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice good solid coat of gloss. This will help protect all of the paintwork that we've done so far and give us a good base on which to start doing a little bit of weathering and things like that. I'm not going to like go crazy on this one, on the weathering. This was a stateside Air National Guard aircraft and would have probably been kept in relatively clean condition, but I do want to show a little bit of grime and a little bit of wear, and as well as using a panel wash to help push the contrast on these parts. So that is the goal here. So we're just going to go ahead and give everything a healthy coat of our panel wash, and not trying to be shy or worry about excess. Just get everything covered. Make sure you're getting all the corners and the crevices and the creases where parts come together. That's where the shadow will be strongest and most prominent on here. The nice thing that I really like about using this Ammo MIG panel liner is, and I've been using it for years now, is just that it's a known quantity to me. It's like I know how well it reacts, or it goes over the aqua gloss. I know how easy it is to remove, and what might be the tells of where stubborn areas might be, things like that. And it's just like, it works for me. It's not the only game out there. There's plenty of other panel liners and washes out there that work. Just within my process, this is the one that I like the most. So once the panel liner dries, usually about 30 minutes, a little bit more, the excess can just be wiped away. You don't need to use thinner. You don't need to use any kind of agent. It just wipes off. And now we're going to go ahead and seal that in with a satin coat. So this will dull down the shine of the gloss coat, as well as seal in our panel wash, and give us kind of our final sheen for the interior here. So give everything a nice good coat, and we can move on to our 3D decals. So like I said, this is the Kellic set, specifically designed for the ModelSVIT P-51H, and just like normal decals, you dip it into water and you let it sit and soften up, and then eventually it'll be ready to apply to your model. Now, in general, I think the intent is that you're supposed to be able just to apply this like a regular decal, and it will stay on. I have heard from multiple people, and through a little bit of my own experience, that you need a little bit more adhesive to get them to stick properly. So I'm just using a little bit of super glue, and this will just help secure the decals into place and prevent them from potentially lifting up or moving around once you get them in the place that you want to. I'm not sure how 3D decals are supposed to react to things like setting solutions, so I have opted not to use any. I just don't want them to like fall apart and disintegrate. So I would avoid using any kind of decal setting solution, softener, things like that, and just apply it with some glue. You can also use some PVA glue. I've seen people use PVA glue as well, as opposed to the super glue. So your mileage may vary. But I think what I like about the 3D decals versus like the pre-painted photo etch is that there's just so much more relief and detail in the 3D decal versus the photo etch. Each little button and switch is present and is raised, and is like noticeably raised, not just like a tiny little bump. And they look good. And I don't know how they do it. Like, I don't know the technology behind how they create the 3D decals, but I'm really liking these as an alternative to using photo etch. Plus, I find them just to be a little bit easier and forgiving to use than the photo etch. So this particular set comes with a nice cushion for the seat, as well as seat belts. And again, I think that the 3D decals have a nice leg up on photo etch when it comes to seat belts, because the 3D decal has some give and bendability to it, if that's a word, as opposed to like the stiffness of a piece of photo etch, especially the pre-painted photo etch, because you can't anneal them. If you were annealing a photo etch seat belt, that might be different, but you can get a slightly more organic looking seat belts with the 3D decals. And again, my actual process for applying them really isn't much different than I would be if I was doing photo etch, but I think it's the end result that is different and better. So while the seat belts are drying on the seat, we can go ahead and start doing all the little sidewall panels. And this set came with a lot of decals. There's a lot of little like instruments and panels along the sidewall, and it does take some time to get all these prepped and installed. But totally think it's one of those things that's absolutely worth it. 100% worth the time. And this set wasn't terribly expensive. I want to say it was like $10 or $12 or something. I mean, no more than a set of photo etch a comparable set of colored photo etch, but 100% worth every penny. And even like versus the decals that the kit came with, the 3D decals were just far superior, both in their detail and resolution. So very nice, and everything looks, I just, as I'm installing these and I'm watching myself do this over, essentially replaying this back as I'm recording this, like I'm just still amazed at how nice they look. And this is definitely like a piece of aftermarket that I think even novice, newer people could give a try and not be completely out of depth for this. So I really like them and would recommend them wholeheartedly for anybody else that's looking to, spruce up their cockpit and details and stuff. So now that the previously glued portions of the seatbelts have dried, we can move on to getting the seatbelts to start laying down. And so again, I'm securing this with some super glue, and it takes a little bit of practice and playing around with to try and get these to go where you want them to. But once you get them there, I think they look pretty good. No like harsh 90-degree bends and folds. Like they seem to, I mean, again, they're not going to be like perfect and look like genuine cloth. And I think if you spent a little bit more time, like, sculpting it, you could get them to look even better. But even for the amount of time that I spent on it, I'm pretty pleased with how they look, and I think they look pretty good. So yeah, definitely recommend the 3D decals, not just for this kit, but for just kits in general. Next up, we're going to be working on the interior weathering and assembly. To do some paint chipping, I'm going to be using this aluminum colored marker from Gallery. And I've essentially applied the marker ink to a palette, and then I'm just applying it by brush just because the felt tip of the marker is a little bit too large for some of the small details that I want to do. But I'm just applying the marker paint over certain areas where I want the paint to look chipped and worn away. And the Gallery marker is really nice because even though it is an acrylic ink, it's got like a lot of opacity to it, and so making small little chips and scratches like this is pretty easy to do. And so I'm just trying to concentrate mainly just like around the seat where there'd be a lot of wear from the pilot, as well as like down here by the rudder pedals where the pilot's feet would be contacting the floor, and because he's constantly moving his feet and the rudder pedals, things like that. That's where I imagine there would be more wear and tear on the paintwork. And so we're just generally just trying to apply a little bit of this aluminum color here, and then we'll do a little bit around like the seat armor, and a few little places on the cockpit sidewall. The just kind of where like in my brain it would make sense where the pilot himself would be moving around, maybe like his the buckles on his parachute or his seatbelt buckles or whatever bang around inside there when he's trying to put them on. Just various. I try to think of like weird narrative items like that to explain why certain areas might have chipped paint versus others. And I think that really helps me work through my process. Is like, okay, what is the mechanism for the weathering, right? And that's really kind of what I mean. And that's obviously in absent like direct, photographic reference of the weathering, but just like in my mind, okay, this makes sense. This to me, this is how it would happen. The pilot's walking across the ground, he gets dirt in his shoes, he walks onto the aircraft, gets inside the cockpit, there's going to be little, dirt's going to transfer in there, that kind of thing. Like, that's what makes sense in my brain. And obviously, like, if you can find photographic reference that backs that up, awesome. That, definitely helpful. So at this point, all the painting is done. We can start getting the cockpit assembled, and the way that the cockpit assembles, it's a lot of like butt joints where like just two parts are meeting up against each other. There are a few times when there's like a little recess for a part to fit into, but again, this is one of those times that I think it's really critical that you're test fitting as you're going along, just to make sure that you know how a part is supposed to attach to the rest of it before you commit to adding glue. It'll save you some headache in the end. And the cockpit, because the cockpit is fully enclosed like this, it's not like on like the other earlier type Mustangs where you would attach the sidewalls to the fuselage halves first and then put the tub in. Like, this is a whole self-contained unit, and I was a little worried that there might be some fit issues, both with just like the way the cockpit fits together and how the cockpit fits into the fuselage. But I'm happy to let you know that the fit here was actually really nice, and I had no issues getting the cockpit to fit within the fuselage halves. There was no, like, it fit almost flawlessly. So getting the cockpit attached to one side here, I'll get this attached in permanently, and then that way I can, like, I have all the stuff on one side of the fuselage. Just kind of makes it easier in the end. One thing I should have done earlier but failed to was to paint the inside of the radiator duct inlet here. So I'm just going to hit this up before I get the fuselage halves put together. This is just getting painted aluminum with the Vallejo model color aluminum here. And yeah, like I said, you really don't see a lot down in here. It's pretty deep inlet, but nevertheless, gotta have something there. So at this point, we can start putting our fuselage together. We can start building the aircraft, as it were, now that all the interior stuff is done. And again, the overall fit here was pretty nice. Because of the way the kit's manufactured, there is kind of like a little bit of a lip where the fuselage halves join, but it kind of ends up working in your favor because it helps. I didn't have to do a lot of like filling in the seam lines, using a generous amount of the Tamiya extra thin glue and then kind of gently squeezing the parts together would get a little bit of that like plastic squish coming out. It helps for cleaning up the seam lines. I mean, you still have to do a fair amount of sanding, but not as much filling as I was expecting. So that's always helpful. The gun barrels are provided in this little part here that's supposed to sit in these openings, and the if you put the fuselage halves on, you can see that like they don't fit correctly, and it leaves an unsightly gap that would be really hard to clean up. So I ended up just omitting the gun barrels completely, and I know that's not like 100% correct, but it just made the construction process much easier. Also, I did need to sand down the top of the wheel well structure just so that the upper halves of the wings would fit on better. So just be aware there's a little bit of fit issue there, but I probably could have come up with some like brass tubes to represent the gun barrels, but I didn't have them on hand, and like I said, I kind of built this kit on a whim, so I'm just rolling with it basically. So once you get the wing halves on, you can clamp them down to make sure they stayed glued. The P-51, pretty much all versions of the P-51 have a set of formation lights underneath the left wing, and they're colored. And so before I close up the other half of the wings, I'm going to, the right wing, not the left wing, use some of the clear paints that I have to paint these little lenses, and then using my gallery metallic marker, back it with this aluminum color, and it'll create this, with the aluminum on the back side of it, it creates this nice like reflection through the clear paint and makes them nice and bright. So we'll go ahead and get that installed. That just goes right into the wing here. And again, this was another area that was like, oh, that might cause fit issues with the wing halves, but it actually fits really nicely, and they fit flush to the bottom surface of the wing. and caused no fit issues fitting the top half of the wing on. So again, I think I was expecting worse out of this kit and was often surprised when it was working really nicely. So I'm going to do like a really sped up version of my whole sanding process here for cleaning up the actual seam lines on my models. And I'm using these sanding sponges from Steady. I've done a review on these as well. In fact, it was using footage from this build that I did the review video on, but they're pretty nice. They're useful in that they kind of get through like most of the hard work. The final, the highest grit, the 2500 grit, I wish it did more polishing. Like I have some 2000 grit sandpaper that I use for polishing that will almost polish clear parts, and the Steady stuff would definitely not polish a clear part. So just be aware. But for all the other, like the intermediate grits, it works really, really nice. I was really happy with how easy they were to work with, and each pad lasts for a long time. Like I haven't gone through very many of them since building this, and so they do have some longevity. So with all of the like super fine surface detail on this kit, I'm going to try something that I don't do very often, where I do a panel wash directly onto the bare plastic. And the purpose of this is to allow me to better see all the detail, but it also helps me identify areas that I might need to clean up, and, like seam line areas that I might need to clean up and do a better job of filling, things like that, where I'm missing detail and where I need to add detail. So I've applied it, let it dry, wiped it off, and you can see here there's these two little spots here that I'm pointing to with my knife blade. So that's where I still need to clean up part of the seam line, so that some of the wash got in there, meaning that there's like an actual hole there, like a divot there that I need to clean up. So it just helps me to quickly identify areas that I need to finish cleaning up. And then it also helps when restoring lost detail. So the Mustangs, the whole Mustang family, or at least anything starting with the Merlin engine, had a split top cowl. So there would be a seam line running down the very top center of the nose of the aircraft. And so that has to be restored. And you might be thinking like, well, why didn't you just leave the panel line there as opposed to filling it, sanding it, and then rescribing it? And the reason why is because I have more control over how the panel line looks by doing it this way than just by leaving a seam line. Because, at least in my opinion, if you leave a seam line to represent a panel line, it usually just ends up looking like a seam line. My opinion, but that's just from my experience. So that's why I filled that seam line in and then replaced the panel line there. Well, I didn't replace it, I added the panel line there. So now we're going to go ahead and restore some rivets using the Galaxy riveting tool. This little tool set here was actually sent to me by one of my patrons. So big thank you to them for sending that out to me, because this is a fantastic tool and it is very nice and easy to use. So basically what I'm going to use here is just use the tape as a guide and run the riveting tool along each line of rivets along the rest of the nose to basically fill in where I've sanded away some of the rivets from the process of cleaning up that seam line. And it doesn't necessarily need to be like a super precise job. I mean, you can certainly, if that's your modeling styles, like you want it precise and perfect, great. But even just using a little strip of tape here, and for me, close is good enough, and I can get these rivets replaced and bring up that level of detail back to what it should be. So it doesn't take very long, which is one of the nice things about doing it this way. It's a fairly quick process, and just like that, we're done. So now I'm going to use an old airbrush needle chucked into a pin vise here to restore the fastener detail that would be on the engine cowl. And there we go. So there's all my restored detail. Pretty happy. Looks pretty good, I think. And at this point, I've also done the back spine of the aircraft underneath the nose and along the bottom of the fuselage as well. Didn't record it because it's really just a lot of the same stuff, just repeated on different sections of the aircraft. So, but you can understand that like I did have to do that whole process on other areas, as well as like the leading edges of the wings, things like that. So now we're going to install the chin intake. So this is the intake that sits just underneath the prop and spinner. This is what was used to bring air in for the actual engine itself. And the fit here was really nice. Fits on pretty good. You know, I mean, once you get the glue on it, it virtually disappears. You'll also notice there's two like recessed areas on the bottom side of the nose. That's actually where some photo etch grills go. And apparently I forgot to film installing the grills, but you'll see them later on. And but it's just a nice detail that the manufacturer included to have that part as photo etch as opposed to just, you know, plastic with some dimples in it. The gun sight is supplied as 2 parts of opaque, you know, just gray plastic. They don't provide any kind of like clear part for the gun sight, so you will need to replicate that yourself. Prior to installing any of the clear parts, the canopy, we have to paint up certain areas. You'll notice here I'm painting the back deck. I actually end up removing that paint and just doing that paint later on in the process, but you know, at least you can see what I'm doing here. So another interesting thing about the P-51H that is different than earlier P-51s is the navigation lights on the wingtips. Previous versions of the Mustangs would have a little light on top and bottom of the wingtip. This version of the Mustang has like a clear portion that is like part of the leading edge of the wingtip and with a bulb inside. And so to replicate the bulb, I drill into the clear part so it creates this little hole in there that I then fill with one of the clear paints, green or red. And that kind of replicates the colored bulb inside of the clear plastic or the clear housing for the navigation light. And you'll see in just a little bit that when I go to install these, that I've painted the part where it attaches black, and what I should have done is added a little bit of that aluminum color behind the bulb to brighten it up a little bit, because honestly, once these are installed and on and all the paint work is on, you can't really notice the bulb all that much. It's just too dark, but you know, hindsight is 20/20. But I am installing this using some UV curing resin. And the reason why I'm using the UV curing resin as opposed to like model glue or super glue is because the resin does not ruin the clear part in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, no fogging, no glue marks. It just basically like an invisible way to install clear parts. So kind of nice. With the navigation lights on, we can go ahead and install the ailerons onto the wing. These are separate. All the control surfaces are separate parts except for the rudder. So that is kind of nice. You have a little bit of posability you can do. The kit also provides you with canopy masks, and I'm always a big fan of included canopy masks. But what's even better about these is they actually include sets for both the inside and outside portions of the canopy, and that's awesome. Like, that's a really cool thing, because being able to paint the inside of a canopy, especially if you're going to plan on having like the cockpit open, is one of those great details that many people don't think to do. And even myself, like, I don't do it in every build, but when I have the option to, like, I definitely take it, because it just helps make the inside look better and more realistic, as opposed to like having paint showing through from like the opposite side. It just looks more realistic. And the masks performed flawlessly. They were very, very thin masks, but they worked really good. And you can see here, nice crisp demarcation between, you know, where the masks were. So definitely a huge added value for this kit is having not only just canopy masks in general, but interior canopy masks. Moving back to the gun sight here, we're just going to, after painting it black, we're going to give it a little bit of a dry brush with a buff color. You could also use like a light gray color to dry brush as well. That would work just as well. I like the buff color just because it to me, it makes it feel a little bit like dustier and dirtier. There's a small pad on the end of the gun sight, so just hitting that with a little bit of like a leather color here. And if I understand correctly, I think that was to, protect the pilot from like smashing his forehead against the gun sight in a violent maneuver or something, but I could be wrong about that. And then finally, the actual emitters for the gun sight, covering with just a couple drops of UV curing resin, and then applying this absurdly small decal that is supposed to say no handhold. So I assume that's to remind like the ground crew or the pilot that to not hold on to the gun sight while they're getting in and out of the cockpit. People often ask me, hey, where do you get the plastic for making your gun sights? And I just use like commercial packaging. You in your day-to-day life, you might often get something that comes in like this clear type plastic. I always try to hang on to a couple of those pieces of packaging because they can easily be cut down and become, things like a gun sight. So basically just cutting it down to the appropriate size and shape, and then we're going to hit it with a little bit of UV curing resin, get that installed on, and there we go. We have our gun sight glass. So pretty easy modification to make, especially one piece of packaging like this could supply hundreds and hundreds of pieces of gun sight glass. So it's definitely one of those things that, before you throw something like that away, just think like, hey, I could use this for gun sight. Installing the gun sight was a little tricky. It's supposed to like install underneath the combing over the instrument panel, and there was really no like solid way that it was attached. It's just kind of there. So it took me a little while to get it into position and like correctly oriented, but once I got it there, I was pretty happy with it. The way that the main front canopy installs on is similar to how like Tammy would do it or Edward does it, where it's like you install like a whole panel with the glass, not just the glass itself. And this is definitely like my preferred way of installing glass, like canopies like this. I think it just makes it a much cleaner and easier fit. But I'm also doing this with the UV curing resin, again, because I wanted to avoid any kind of like glue smudges or fogging, that kind of thing. So I'm really been using the UV curing resin a lot more frequently than in my builds than I did previously. And it's becoming a very nice and versatile tool to use. So at this point, there's a lot of like smaller things that need to get assembled, horizontal stabilizers, elevators, propeller, things like that. So we're going to kind of go ahead and speed through a lot of this just so you can kind of see what's involved, but it's really nothing, groundbreaking or different from other model kits of a similar nature. It all goes together pretty much without issue. The one area that I did have some trouble with is the propeller spinner, and it just did not fit together good, like gaps and raised ridges. And so I ended up having to spend a fair amount of time like sanding it down and blending it in so that it looked like more of like a homogeneous piece than just like two ill-fitting parts. And now we've gone ahead and masked up our canopy and our cockpit and our wheel wells. So, and you can also see those photo etch plates on the underside of the nose. The bomb shackles can get installed on as well. The aircraft could take bombs, rockets, drop tanks, and the kit actually provides rockets. It provides drop tanks, but there are a couple of pictures of the aircraft that I planned on building, and none of them had rockets or drop tanks installed. So I'm going to try and replicate the picture, come close to replicating what the picture shows. The landing gear are a multi-part affair, and I decided to add some brake line detail here, and just using a little bit of steel wire and some really thin Tamiya tape here. This is again, and I've done a video on this a couple years ago talking about simple ways to improve a World War II aircraft kit, and one of those things was adding brake lines to your model. And And you'll see here, it's not terribly difficult to do, and it doesn't take a lot of time. It does take a little bit of practice and a little bit of patience, but once you get the hang of it, it's a really fun improvement to make, because it's just one of those details that can be quite noticeable on your model, especially if you have like an aircraft like this that has like a tail dragger type aircraft, so that the main landing gear are up front and center, prominent on the model itself. And so it's something that's easily visible, but doesn't take a lot of time to add. But honestly, it adds a lot of detail to your build. If you're interested in that video, I definitely recommend checking out. There's some I feel like I have some good tips in there to help people, and pretty much people of any skill level, just to improve, help them improve the detailing of their kits. This is definitely something even a beginner can try and attempt to do. So definitely one of those things that I would recommend doing. The what are these? The scissors, the oleo scissors here, multi-part construction, very tiny pieces. Nearly lost one of them to the carpet monster, but fortunately I was able to find it. So these go together, but they look pretty nice. Better than just having it molded on, I suppose. Although some other manufacturers would have it as like a single piece that you glue on, but I mean, it looks good in the end, even though it's kind of a pain. So now, before we go ahead and start getting everything painted up, we're going to go ahead and give everything a wipe down with some isopropyl alcohol. This is just going to help remove any kind of like residue from like skin oils or chemicals, paints, whatever, that will give us a nice, clean, solid base to start our paintwork on, and, hopefully avoid any issues. So the next step is going to be primer and paint. And again, we're going to be using the Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black as our primer. And I've thinned this out a little bit more than I normally would. So you'll see some of these parts that it looks like it's going on pretty thin, and that's on purpose. And I really wanted to try and preserve as much of the very fine surface detail as I could on this kit by going as thin as possible with the paint here. But we're going to go ahead and give everything a coat of the primer. This is going to help us to, multiple reasons for doing a primer. Chiefly among them all is just making sure that the paint adheres to the model. I primarily use acrylic paints, and acrylic paints don't often have the best adhesive properties over bare plastic. And so a good primer is essential, in my opinion. I do know that there are some people out there that will do great work without a primer, and I wish I could have their confidence to do that. But for me, this is what works. So that gives us a good way to get my acrylic paints to adhere to the plastic, but it also makes everything even. So if I have like plastic, if I have resin, if I have metal, they all become equal under a coat of primer for everything that's going to come on top of it. So that's why I do a primer. The next layer here we're doing is this aluminum color on the underside of the aircraft. Now, as far as I understand, at least with this aircraft in particular, because it was kind of a one-off for the Pennsylvania Air National Guard, is that the underside wasn't actually bare metal. It was like a painted lacquer, like an aluminum lacquer. So again, that's why I'm using the Vallejo color as opposed to like what I would normally use, which was an Alclad, to represent that. And now I'm going with the red. Now initially I had decided to go a little bit dark with this, so I mixed some X7 with some NATO black to get this like nice deep dark red color. But I didn't realize that I had actually used the X7, which is a gloss paint, and I wasn't loving the look of the gloss paint, and it ended up being more dark than I was expecting and hoping for. So I'm actually going to go back over everything with XF7, which is flat red, which is going to brighten things up a little bit, but it actually kind of worked out in a roundabout way to look good, because it helps create like a little bit of almost like pre-shading, as it were. I was able to kind of like mist it on, do it a little bit heavier in the center of the panels, that kind of a thing, and create just a little very faint hint of like mottling and, and pre-shading, that kind of a thing. So in the end it worked out, but just that's kind of like what's going on here and why I did it the way I did. This particular paint scheme with the Pennsylvania Air National Guard, like I mentioned before, I think it was a one-off. It was just this one aircraft that was painted this way, and I don't know why it was done. I don't know if it was like for high recognition, high visibility, that kind of a thing. Not quite sure, but right now we're going to paint the anti-glare panel, the deck behind the pilot, and then it had two black stripes on the wings as well, so we'll go ahead and get those painted at the same time. And I had a lot of fun overall doing the paint job on this, just because it's so different than pretty much anything I've ever done, especially on a Mustang before, where like the whole Mustang is painted this rather bold color and quite unique. I'm really enamored with this paint job, because all the other paint schemes in the box were like natural metal finish, and this was just something that was different and, will kind of stand out in my collection amongst a sea of natural metal Mustangs, that kind of a thing. The exhaust panels got masked off and painted as well, and then we can move on to painting the prop. So I'm using this Outlaw Paints yellow. So this is an acrylic lacquer, and I'll be completely honest, I don't totally understand exactly what that means by acrylic lacquer, but this is one of my more favorite yellows to use, because it really gives after a couple of coats, it gives a nice, good, solid, full body yellow. I really like it. And then we're going to go ahead and mask off the propeller tips and hit the propeller blades with NATO black. Now, the spinner is going to be black to match the anti-glare panel, and that's the straight black. So I painted the propeller blades in NATO black because I wanted there to be a subtle difference between the black of the spinner and the black of the propeller blades. So now we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice good seal underneath our Alclad Aqua Gloss, and this will also prepare us for doing our decals and weathering. So everything gets a gloss coat, and again, this kind of goes back to the concept of the primer, where I'm gloss coating things that don't necessarily need to be gloss coated, because either A, I'm not putting a decal on it, or I'm not going to be doing a panel liner on it, but it makes everything even, and if I can maintain that consistency across the model, then in the end result I have a little bit more control over what the model looks like. Now, there might be times when I don't paint something gloss, but it's usually because I've got a very specific reason not to. But in general, everything is getting gloss coated right now, so that everything is kind of brought up to the same level and the same location, or not location, but just the same starting point, as it were. So now we can move on to the decals. These are the kit decals, and overall they performed fairly well. Initially they felt very thick, and it was hard to kind of get them to settle down over irregular surfaces and into panel lines. You'll see here in just a moment what I mean by that. But in the end, they actually reacted really well to my Solvaset, and I was able to get them to mostly snuggle down into the surface details pretty good. There were a few areas where the decals ripped on me, but not in an unrecoverable way. But you can kind of see here, the decal does feel a little thick, trying to get it to set down, over that very specific bump on the wing. But again, in general, they seemed to work pretty good. They had good color, good register, minimized carrier film where applicable. You have these big decals on the wing, and lots of carrier film here, but I was able to pretty much get that carrier film to disappear once I got it, or once it reacted with the Solvaset. So in the end, I was pleased with how they turned out, and I would generally say there's not a huge issue with these decals, even though this is my first time using them, so this is really kind of like my first reaction to them. But overall, the decals for this kit for this paint scheme aren't terribly complicated. It's mainly just the national insignias, the large Air National Guard registration, tail number, that kind of thing, and a couple of walkway decals, and that's about it. So it was pretty straightforward. Not a lot of stencil data. Again, because I think this was a one-off paint scheme, a lot of the stencil data was probably just painted over. So once the decals have had a chance to settle down and dry, I go ahead and gloss coat over all the decals. This seals them in and allows me to do the next weathering steps over the decals without, staining and ruining the decals. So all the decals get another healthy coat. And now we're going to bring back our enamel wash here from Ammo MIG. And again, we're just going to apply it generously all over the kit. This is mainly just to try and, take advantage of all that very fine surface detail, all the nice rivet detail, and hopefully help things just pop just a little bit. This brown doesn't have a lot of contrast with the red color that we painted on the fuselage. And in hindsight, I may have actually gone for a black color over the red. I think it would have helped the surface detail stand out a little bit more, but I mean, it doesn't look bad, and it's definitely a lot more subtle than I was originally going for. But over like the metallic areas, it really looks nice and really pops. So just like all the other times that we've used the panel liner, once it dries, we can go ahead and just start wiping all the excess away. But you can see in those little rivet details on the bottom of the wing there, just how nicely those pop and how nice those look. But against the red surfaces, it doesn't pop quite as much, but it's all right. It's not meant to be like a super dirty weathered aircraft anyway. So in the end, it's one of those things that I'm fine with and I can live with, and doesn't necessarily bother me. Just if I were to do it again, I would do it differently. But we're gonna go ahead and get this all cleaned up, get the rest of the aircraft looking nice, and try to make sure that we don't have any just excess wash hanging out that might get sealed in later. So right now I'm just using the paper towel, but eventually I moved to using like a cotton bud Q-tip to get to some of the harder to reach places and some of the more stubborn areas, things like that. And now we can go ahead and do a little bit of assembly before we do our next varnish coat. So we're going to get the flaps installed here, and the tight is really fit here. You can almost press fit these in, but a little bit of super glue will help lock them in. And definitely like the contrast between like the metal inner part. I think it looks really cool. Get the horizontal stabilizers installed at this point. The reason why I left them off was just for ease of painting, because the bottom halves had to be painted aluminum and just less masking in the long run. So liking how those are looking. Now we're going to go ahead and give everything a satin varnish. And I've mentioned in previous videos that I'm trying to stay away from like just solid flat or matte coats, unless there's a very specific need for it. I like the satin coat now because it dulls down the gloss coat, but it still has just a little hint of a shine, which you can on many aircraft, or I should just say like military vehicles in general. Even though like they may have like a flat or matte paint job, like there's still an inherent shine to them, either from like wear or just the material that they're made out of. And so that's kind of why I like using a satin coat now more as opposed to a direct flat coat, just so we can still get a little hint of a shine. So at this point, because we're done with all of our varnishes, we can go ahead and remove our canopy masking. And again, the kit canopy masks worked flawlessly. Very pleased and very, very crisp and clear how they turned out. So yeah, definitely a thumbs up to the manufacturer for that. We'll have to do a little bit of touching up by hand for the areas around the cockpit, but that won't take too long. So at this point now, we're really just going to be assembling everything and putting it all together to finish off the build here. We can go ahead and get the prop installed and assembled on the spinner. And again, so that's where I was trying to have a slight difference between the props hub, the spinner hub, and the prop blades themselves. Get this little deck piece installed in the rear canopy. This is kind of a departure from like the P-51D which was completely open. They didn't have this little deck in the D model Mustangs. And so we go ahead and get that installed. The the wastegate area for the radiator has a little actuator, and it's a plastic part. It's very, very delicate. I ended up gluing it in without being painted, and then just decided to paint it in situ like that. Just a little bit easier. Doing a little bit of exhaust staining, mainly just using this like neutral gray color, just to kind of show like the high octane fuel, how it discolors the surface. I didn't do the exhaust staining very well. My paint was just a little on the thick side, and I'm not like super pleased with how it turned out. It's not awful, but it's one of those things that it will annoy me when I look at it, just because I know I can do better, but it is what it is. I never mentioned yet, but the kit actually comes with rubber tires, and I don't normally like rubber tires on model kits, but these ones are like really nice looking and very sharp, very crisp detail, and fit really well. And I was able to even, sand down one little portion of it to kind of give it a nice little flat spot. So yeah, they're actually pretty decent in my opinion. Installing the landing gear was an issue. They didn't fit super well, and they wanted to torque a little bit to one side, so it kind of took a little bit of back and forth to get those installed properly, and they're pretty spindly, even more so than on a normal Mustang. Additionally, the tail wheel was also like a really delicate, spindly assembly, and care must be taken to install it so that you don't accidentally snap off one of these little, braces that are on there. But once you get the landing gear installed and it's cured, it's pretty solid and pretty robust. It's just on their own by themselves, they are kind of spindly, but so far it's been sitting in my display case now for a couple months and hasn't really had any issues, just sitting there. Landing gear doors going on. Again, like there's so many similarities to the P-51D, but when you actually start to like really look at the details here, like the landing gear doors are really narrow compared to how they are on the P-51D, and the wheels are actually like a lot smaller than on the P-51D. Like it just looks odd and different if you're used to the P-51D. I've handled this enough now and looked at it enough now that it's starting to look like its own thing, and I'm not constantly being like, oh, that does not look like a P-51D, but it takes a little bit of time to get to that point. Getting the doors on the back part here, other manufacturers have the doors as like molded on pieces, and as annoying as it is to install these separately, like it's so much easier to paint them this way. So I'm glad they did that. Get this little antenna installed, and some more aerials here for the aircraft. I like that it's got these like twin antennas on the back here. This looks really cool. That the Pacific Mustang that I built also had these like twin antennas that I just think that looks cool. I don't know why. I mean, a normal Mustang would have like one antenna there, which still looks cool, but I don't know. It just kind of, it works for me, I guess. The pitot tube going on, there was no, like the instructions say that it goes on this part of the wing, but there was no physical indication of where it was supposed to go. So I think I got it as close as I can, but it might be off. Getting the antennas painted up. The blade antennas were painted black per the instructions and per the reference images that I had, which makes it easy to get them painted. I probably could have, if they had to be painted red or something like that to match the rest of the aircraft, I would have done that prior to installing them. But this is pretty simple. Go ahead and get the spinner installed. I don't often leave my spinners free spinning. I will usually like pick an orientation and then glue it in there, just because it's just one less part to potentially fall off and lose or whatever. So just not a feature that I like is spinning props. Now we can get the canopy installed, and that wraps up our build. So, final thoughts on the build. I really, really enjoyed this kit. It definitely presented a few challenges. There are some fit issues and a few like detail issues, but nothing that your average modeling skills can't overcome. And with the very unique paint scheme, with this cool red and like metallic color with black accents, like this was one that I couldn't pass up. And adding the 3D decals really helped elevate the interior, in my opinion. I'm really pleased with how those turned out. I like the little details that I added, the brake lines, things like that. And overall, like, yeah, this is a kit that I'm really excited to have in my collection, to help pad out my series of P-51s that I'm building. I purchased the F-82 kit, which is the twin Mustang version of this from the same manufacturer, from ModelSVIT, and that one's got some interesting, unique paint schemes, so definitely want to get that one on the workbench at some point. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this kit if you're a fan of the Mustang at all, and you want essentially like the top version of the Mustang. I would recommend the kit to most average builders. As long as you have some experience and you have you're confident in your skills, I think you could tackle this kit. I definitely wouldn't recommend it for new builders, beginner builders, but your average builder, I think, would easily have a good time with this kit. And I think the results are fantastic. It's a unique look, and when you have it up against other Mustangs and like next to a P-51D, you can really see the differences and in the overall shape and size and dimensions of everything, and it looks good. So if you've managed to make it through this far into the video, I appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting this channel. I need to give a huge shout out to my patrons for supporting this channel, for supporting me as a content creator. I greatly appreciate it. If you're not yet subscribed, please consider subscribing. And yeah, let me know what you think about the video. Leave me a comment down below. I love to hear from you. I love to interact with you. I try to answer every single comment that you leave. So don't be shy. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can head over to my Patreon. It's links listed down below, or head on over to my Instagram as well. I post, current work in progress stuff over on my Instagram at least once or twice a week, to kind of just keep people updated on what's currently happening. And yeah, I got a lot of good content there. And so yeah, thank you for watching. Really appreciate it. Hit like, subscribe, all the normal, YouTube things that you do. Please do that. And we'll see you guys on the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye.